Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Online shopping has come into its own, and this is causing enormous disruptions in the traditional retail industry. Shopping malls and department stores are closing at an alarming rate. Staggering job losses are occurring. Some of the most famous brand names are disappearing. Is this just part of the ordinary business cycle, or are we witnessing a fundamental change in one of the bedrock elements of American culture and the U.S. economy? The way we shop. I'll talk about this with my guest, Mark Cohen, a former Sears executive who now heads the Retail Studies program at the Columbia University Business School. Mark, welcome. Nice to have you.
Nice to be here.
So there have been a number of articles recently suggesting that we're at some sort of a tipping point in the retail industry in this country. One article actually had a headline suggesting that we're approaching a retail apocalypse. What in fact is going on? Are we at some sort of tipping point?
I think we are. I think we're seeing every manifestation you can imagine of an enormous change in the industry. You know, in the 50s and 60s, the Great American Shopping Mall emerged, and it hollowed out hundreds of downtown business districts across the United States. Right. In fact, we're sitting in a studio that used to be the Altman's department store.
This used to be a giant department store.
That's right.
Very famous.
So that sea change occurred over several decades. Those shopping malls were overbuilt. They followed the path of Dwight Eisenhower's interstate highway system. Every off-ramp saw the opportunity to establish some kind of a mall. Now we're seeing the internet do the same thing to those shopping malls. So this is another tipping point. This is possibly of more consequence than the establishment of malls in the first place, though.
One of the big deals, of course, has to do with the implications for employment, and we're seeing substantial job losses in the retail industry. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, shopping malls are local. They're located in close proximity to residential communities who form the basis of their customers, their customer audience, if you will. Most shopping malls are staffed by people who are also local. Who come from the community that surrounds those malls. As these malls, and there are probably 1,000 of them at risk, are slowly shutting down, becoming less popular, and in some cases actually closing, they're losing their customer base and they're losing their employment roles. The problem is these folks are often unable to migrate somewhere else. They're not about to drive 50 or 100 miles to a distribution center representing an internet retailer who's hiring people. So there's this enormous disruption and dislocation that's occurring.
And we've been losing tens of thousands of these jobs each month over the past few months, right?
We have, and I think it's going to continue right through the end of this year.
Now, you describe these, what's going on in the industry as a rolling crisis. Workers lose their jobs, then they in turn spend less money, which hurts the industry further. Can you talk about that? What are the implications of that for retail overall, not just the traditional retail outlets?
Well, the backdrop is that 70% of all of our economic activity is directly or indirectly related to the retail industry. As folks lose their jobs, they have less disposable income. They spend less on all of the retail establishments that they would normally come in contact with. And so there's a ripple effect that's pronounced, something we've seen wherever industries have been in transition. When the automotive industry went through travails some decades ago, Michigan was hollowed out the effects were far more pervasive than just the automotive business itself.
We're still seeing those effects.
Yes, we
today.
are. Yes, we
so
are.
now new jobs are being created. Jobs are being, with the advance of online shopping. So jobs in transportation. You mentioned these giant warehouses where goods are stockpiled and that sort of thing. To what extent will that offset some of the harsher aspects of the job losses in the traditional stores?
Well, there's a disconnect geographically because distribution centers that service internet customers are typically located well away from population centers. And so folks who are losing their job working in the mall are not likely to be able to migrate to a location that's considerably further away. In addition, the jobs that are being created are entry-level, low-wage, minimum wage. There's an enormous amount of automation that's being introduced in these giant distribution centers. And so there's no doubt opportunities that the internet is creating, but it's not on a one-for-one basis.
Now you touched on this, but the loss of these retail stores and what's happening with the shopping malls and that sort of thing has an effect on the real estate market and even specific neighborhoods. How does that work?
There's nothing more insidious than dark stores that are closed. Mm-hmm. When an anchor store in a mall closes, it casts a tremendous cloud over the mall. It makes the mall less attractive. Footsteps diminish. That creates a negative cascade of effects. Specialty stores inside the mall between the anchors start to close. So, there's nothing more dangerous for a real estate development than empty spaces.
And these empty spaces then have a toxic effect on the entire neighborhood.
They do unless someone can step in and redevelop them. There is some effort going on, there has been for some time, to create lifestyle centers out of traditional shopping malls, introducing entertainment, restaurant venues of that sort. But at the end of the day, there are a few of those that have been successful where the vast majority are simply being hollowed out.
One of the things I find interesting about this surge of online retail is that it wasn't that long ago an awful lot of people were wary about putting their credit card information on the internet. They didn't want to just pop those keys in the computer and send off to these strange forces, all this data about their credit and that sort of thing. That has obviously subsided and people are now doing it willy-nilly. What is it that persuaded so many millions of people, well, it's kind of fine to put your credit card info in there?
I think customers have begun to realize in enormous numbers that every time they use their credit card, every time they hand their credit card to a waiter or a waitress, they're relinquishing some element of their identity, which is essentially no different than keying in their account numbers on a laptop, if you will. So I think the concern has abated. It essentially has gone away. And in addition, there was the view 20 years ago that no one would ever want to buy anything but a book or a movie on the internet. After all, I mean, who would want to shop that way? Here we are where there's virtually nothing that people will not seek via the internet.
Well, it's really true that shopping was part of the American lifestyle. I mean, people really got a kick out of shopping, browsing. I mean, I still love to browse in bookstores, even though there are fewer and fewer bookstores. But what happened to that aspect of American life? Are people just not into shopping in regular stores as much as they once were? Is it not as much fun?
I don't think brick and mortar shopping is going to disappear. I think that the super regional malls that are fully tenanted, that don't have enough parking on weekends, will always be an attractive destination for customers. But they have an alternative. So for browsing that's not consequential, or for families who are time-starved, this is an extraordinarily more convenient way to see what's out there and determine what they'd like from the comfort of their living room. If you will.
Right. I mean, that's one of the great advantages of shopping online is it's so convenient. But also, it's generally significantly cheaper. So people pay close attention to the pricing, obviously. But are there downsides to shopping online?
Well, pricing tends to be cheaper because the internet players, for example, Amazon, have focused on everyday low prices. That was their raison d'etre in entering the space in the first place, convenience and price. Mm-hmm. Now it's convenience, price, and breadth of assortment. So there's not a lot of cognitive dissonance when you shop on the internet. Pricing is transparent. You can go from site to site to site looking at comparative prices, as opposed to having to walk up and down the mall or visit several different malls to see what your choices might cost you. So this is an enormously efficient way for consumers to make decisions based upon price.
Now, when I think about people buying clothing online, which is has become an enormous aspect of online retail, there's something about when you shop in a what I think of as a normal or traditional store. You think about the fit that you're getting. You get you can examine the texture of fabrics and that sort of thing. How does this shade look versus that shade or some other color? You do lose some of that, or a lot of that, I would think, if you're shopping online. And you had mentioned to me about returns. You weren't speaking specifically about clothing, but returns in general about shopping online. Is that a big problem?
It's an enormous problem. It's an enormous challenge. Some customers will always want to touch and feel and try the things that they're considering buying. But alternatively, they can sit in their living room in the middle of the night in their underwear and order a size medium, large, extra large, a black, a brown, a navy. Often pay no shipping charges, receive what they've chosen a day or two later, and then return most of it, all of it, some of it, also at no charge.
Right.
So it's not the same as actually slipping on something in a fitting room, coming out in front of a mirror and checking it out. But for many people, it's a much more convenient and interesting way to shop than what we're used to in the past.
Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that Amazon, which is such a dominant force in the online industry, is actually opening brick and mortar stores, and if I'm not mistaken, a lot of them. What's going on there? And if the retail industry is in some kind of slide, why do we suspect that Amazon might do well there?
Well, this may in fact be a bit of a head feint. You know, there was a rumor that they were going to open 2,000 bookstores, and I think the rumor came from the real estate industry that was hoping they would open 2,000 bookstores. They are opening bookstores, but I think they're really acting as showrooms for their technology products, principally their Kindle and Fire tablets, and of course this new device, this ubiquitous Amazon Echo, which I think is a fascinating portal into the Amazon marketplace.
Talk about the Echo a little bit.
So this is the forefront of artificial intelligence. Rather than simply listen to music coming from a dumb speaker that sits on a shelf or sits nearby, this is a device that you can have a conversation with, at least at a rudimentary level. You can talk to it, ask it to do something for you, and it's increasingly able to respond. If you ask for Mozart, it will effortlessly play you an endless selection of Mozart.
Right.
If you ask it for the local news or the weather or the baseball scores, it will respond almost as if it's a companion. Now, it's an early stage technology, it's an early stage device, but I think this is the portal for the future. This is that brave new world of robotic companions I think we're seeing the first manifestations of.
You're telling this to somebody who decades ago had stacks and stacks of 45s that he was playing on this little, almost like a plastic record player, over and over again until these records wore out. I mean, it's really an entirely new world.
It is, and the world continues to change.
You know, we mentioned that retail is suffering to a significant degree, but should the operators of these retail stores and shopping malls and that sort of thing, should they have seen this coming and should they have been better prepared? Or is this a case of there was not really much that they could have done?
I think they definitely, many of them are suffering for the fact that they paid no attention to this trend, just as downtown retailers in the 50s and 60s paid no attention to the emergence of malls.
To the malls, right.
So you could blame the disruptor or the disruptee, and I blame the disruptee. I blame the traditional legacy organizations that got in on the internet late and are still playing sort of a half game rather than a full court game, if you will.
Right.
This is human nature, you know. These are organizations full of smart people who would just as soon not confront the presence of this kind of change, but now it's upon them.
We've been talking about online versus brick and mortar stores, but how's retail overall doing? Is the retail industry healthy? Is it thriving, or is it struggling?
Well, the retail industry is a cipher for the economy at large. Mm-hmm. And so we've long ago emerged from this recession, although there's been some significant dislocation within the population at large. You know, the 1% get a lot richer and the folks in the middle class continues to struggle. There's a shift in what people spend their money on. There's virtually no one between the ages maybe 15 and 75 who's not in possession of a smartphone.
That's true.
Which consumes an enormous amount of their time, attention, and their disposable income. Mm-hmm. So young people are fixated on technology and experience, and the loser, if you will, are the sweaters and shoes and accessories they're not buying today as their parents would have.
Well, you said, retail is essentially a proxy for the overall economy. Do you think the economy is in pretty good shape? I mean, the unemployment rate is low, but there are many other factors that play into it. How good a shape is the U.S. economy in right now?
Well, I think we look fine, but that's a characterization that doesn't work for an awful lot of people. Mm-hmm. There's tremendous embedded inflation that the government doesn't recognize. I mean, when did you last look at a regular bill that you receive every month and celebrate the fact that it declined?
It just never happens.
It doesn't happen. Everything seems to constantly inflate.
And yet when you look at the national numbers, inflation is almost flat.
Well, the economists would say there's no inflation. From a working class point of view, there's tremendous inflationary pressure. Everything you can think of that surrounds your life is always becoming more expensive. And there's tremendous pressure on wages. A lot of these retail job dislocations are causing people to go down market in their wages rather
Right.
than give them a pathway to earn more. So this kind of dislocation is embedded in what looks like a robust and healthy economy.
And when you think about the dislocation, I tend to think about debt levels. And we saw during the Great Recession and the housing foreclosure crisis what can happen when debt levels get too high, bubbles occur, and that sort of thing. In the immediate aftermath of the recession, debt levels went down as Americans began to pay off their bills and that sort of thing. Is that still the case, or are they rising again?
I think we're right back to our old bad behaviors. Following the recession, savings rates increased. Lots of people in the United States paid down or did not continue to add to their debt because they couldn't afford it. But I think we're starting to see the ubiquitous credit offers
Right.
here in your mailbox
Right.
as they once were. I think the economists would acknowledge that consumer debt is rising once again. And then, of course, there's this $1 trillion student loan debt that sort of hangs as a cloud over millennials, if you will. And there's a reckoning that I think we're going to have to face in that regard.
You were actually talking about sort of we have this disconnect between the folks who are in the high-end aspect of the economy and then the people who are struggling and at the lower end. And I often wonder how long can this disconnect continue? How long can the inequality continue? Inequality is not a great word, but that is what we're seeing. And my question is, in an economy in which consumer spending is 70% of the economy, but you have so many people who are either out of work, they're not being counted as out of work, so they're not factored into the unemployment rate. You have so many people out of work and so many people underemployed, low wages, part-time work, and that sort of thing. Is there a day of reckoning that has to come at some point because people just don't have enough money to spend? Or are there enough people who are like really wealthy, not just the top 1%, but I don't know, maybe the top 10 or 15% who have a tremendous amount of money? Are they capable of carrying the economy indefinitely?
Well, intellectually, I'd like to sign up for the trickle-down theory of economics. You know, the very wealthy, the very prosperous,
Right.
will cause lots of good things to happen down market throughout the country and the world, but I really can't get comfortable with that. I think at the end of the day, this country, post-World War II, had an enormous, almost endless round of prosperity fueled by the emergence of a middle class. Certainly the retail industry exploded on that basis. And that middle class has been stuck. And if you're optimistic, you say, well, it'll slowly improve. If you're pessimistic, you would say the middle class is disappearing, if you will. I'm frightened by the continued path of income inequality that we see year over year. And what we hear from our politicians in Washington suggests that's going to continue to take place.
We have about a minute and a half left. What do you think would help? What do you think might kickstart the economy in a way that would begin to turn this inequality around? Is it government action? Is it something that has to emerge from the corporations? Is it something that the people themselves need to do? What would you like to see happen?
Well, I think that we would all recognize that infrastructure is a crisis throughout the country. You can't go anywhere without being taken aback by the infrastructure that's falling down around us. And so if somehow the government and private industry could coalesce around the idea of rebuilding this country, I think that would be of tremendous value.
I couldn't agree more. We've run out of time. I loved it. Mark Cohen, thank you so much. I hope we can have you back again.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. President Trump gave an interview recently to Julie Pace of the Associated Press. It was so strange that the Washington Post felt compelled to annotate the transcript, pointing out the comments that were confusing or nonsensical or weren't true at all. At the top of the transcript, the Post noted that some of Trump's claims were astonishing, including that he may have given the greatest speech ever delivered in the history of the House chamber, and that a Democrat told him he'd be among the greatest presidents ever. Trump was asked in the interview if he agreed with Attorney General Jeff Sessions that Julian Assange, the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, should be arrested. Trump said, "When WikiLeaks came out, I never heard of WikiLeaks, never heard of it." In fact, Trump was both gleeful and encouraging of WikiLeaks as it released information damaging to Hillary Clinton. As the Post noted, Trump, the candidate, literally said, "I love WikiLeaks." When the AP reporter pressed Trump in the interview, asking whether he supported what Assange is doing, the president replied, "I don't support, or unsupport. Regarding the Iran nuclear deal, Trump was asked how Angela Merkel of Germany and Theresa May of Great Britain responded when he talked to them about the agreement. "I don't talk to them about it," the president replied. Incredulous, the AP reporter said, "You don't talk to them about the Iran deal?" Trump said, "I mention it, but it's very personal when I talk to them. You know, it's confidential." Trump bragged shamelessly about the ratings he gets for television newscasters, but then insisted he doesn't watch networks like CNN or MSNBC. "I never thought I had the ability to not watch what is unpleasant if it's about me, or pleasant," he said. He seemed amazed at this newfound ability. "I never thought I'd be able to do that. And for me," he said, "it's so easy to do now." That's from an interview with the man who was the President of the United States. That's all for now. See you next time.